You have a foreign corporation or a foreign government that wants something from the State Department while Hillary Clinton is Secretary of State. They will make a large payment to the Clinton Foundation. That will be followed by favorable action on their behalf. If that happens one or two times, you might say, look, it's just a coincidence. But when you see the pattern recreated over and over and over again, you have to recognize that these events are connected. They've created a model for massive self-enrichment that allows you to go into so-called public service, but get extremely rich at the same time. What's so shocking to a lot of people is that making of that money requires them to betray their progressive values, the environment, labor unions, women's rights, human rights. The Clintons are doing business and growing rich with the favor of the very individuals who you would expect to be their political opposites. When people think of the Clintons taking foreign money, they think it's maybe an insurance company from Great Britain, or they think it's from a supermarket chain in Canada. The fact of the matter is a lot of that money comes from the darkest, worst corners of the world.
Hey, welcome back to part 2 of the Genuine Questions mini-series on Hillary's emails. But before we pick up where we left off, I do want to take a minute to explain that when I started following these stories in the news, I had no political agenda that I was supporting. I didn't really care that much about politics in 2015. I was a true crime aficionado and watched a lot of shows like Breaking Bad, Narcos, House of Cards, and found all of that to be very interesting. It just, then I started to notice that those similar types of storylines were playing out in real life. So why not watch reality instead? There's this quote by Trey Gowdy that I like, that's, we have to treat our friends the same way that we do our enemies. And I've always really liked that because, A, I agree with it. Also, if you're complaining about something or an issue, but you're only upset when people you don't like are doing it, then you don't really care about the issue that you're complaining about. You're a hypocrite, basically. And that's what I don't want to see in government and law enforcement, with the people who we should be holding to the highest levels of scrutiny with the power and privileges they get from being an elected official. That's what I don't want to see from them, that they think they are above the rules that are set forth for everyone else. So these videos aren't just one thing that I have watched and gotten all this information. This is just truly me following the storyline as I have watched it play out over the past 5 years. And with that being said, we'll get started with part number 2 here, and with getting back into that congressional hearing with Mark Meadows and Tom Fitton, talking about some of the issues that were plaguing the Clinton Foundation when they were having internal audits. Here we go with that.
Everybody's talking about how great the Clinton Foundation is and how above board and A ratings and platinum ratings and gold ratings and all of this. There is a report from November 10th of 2008, which is an internal audit. It actually comes from an internal audit that has a conclusion. It says the challenges and deficiencies plaguing the foundation cannot be overstated. There are real and undermine the organization's effectiveness immediately and more long term. To address these issues that present immediate threats, the foundation should revamp its legal and HR operations, should review its governance structure and documents, and should have an open and honest discussion with the president about the future of the foundation. And then another audit in 2011, as you talk about, by a very different firm, talked about the potential conflicts of interest and the fact that those conflicts of interest policies that were suggested to be put in place. However, this is a quote, however, we did not find any evidence of the enforcement of the conflict of conflict of interest. Are you saying that in your discovery process with FOIA that there is a potential conflict of interest between the charitable mission of the Clinton Foundation and what might have been?
So it's not a Trump supporter Twitter conspiracy that the foundation was up to something shady. There were multiple audits and bipartisan congressional concern. The most damning piece of circumstantial evidence is what happened immediately following Hillary's loss in 2016. This article here reports an 88% loss in foreign donations to the Clinton Foundation in just 1 year after her loss. I've also seen this number reported as 86%, and in that hearing that we just showed, Tom Fitton testified to a 62% drop-off in foreign donation. So even if we take the lowest reported figure, we can still give the foundation the benefit of the doubt that even that figure has been exaggerated. And we can still recognize the appearance that at least 50% of Clinton Foundation donations were contingent upon her holding political office, which doesn't jive with the notion that she was keeping those two entities separate. In this next clip, Congressman Bloom cites where it appears that Hillary was taking bribes at the State Department in exchange for donations to the Clinton Foundation. And honestly, the way that it was set up was genius. It's a brilliant money laundering scheme under the guise of humanitarian work. And what kills me is the thought that she probably would have gotten away with all of it had she not decided to run for president, causing her political opponents to start digging around in Benghazi again for campaign dirt.
In 2016, the Clinton Foundation received a $28 million donation from Morocco's King Mohammed. And shortly thereafter, Secretary of State Clinton relaxed U.S. foreign aid restrictions on Morocco. Laureate University, $17.6 million to President Clinton, while Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, to be the honorary chancellor. I did not know that paid so well.
Mm-hmm.
The founder at that university has another organization called International Youth Foundation that received $40 million in grants while Secretary Clinton was in office. After she left office, the grants went from $40 million to a little over $3 million. A Ukrainian oil and steel magnate, Mr. Pinchuk, donated between $10 to $25 million to the Clinton Foundation. In return, he was offered priority access to the State Department. Mr. Fenton, would you say it's quid pro quo?
It certainly seems that way. And this is why Mrs. Clinton promised these disclosures, and which makes it so problematic that these disclosures weren't followed as they were supposed to have been. We asked the State Department, give us the agreement. What did Mr. Clinton agree to do in exchange for that enormous amount of money? But that portion was blacked out by the State Department.
So there's this book called Clinton Cash by a guy named Peter Schweitzer. And in it, he outlines a bunch of instances where companies and foreign governments made either donations to the Clinton Foundation or paid Bill Clinton for a speech and subsequently received a favorable decision from Hillary's State Department. There is a documentary based on this book online, which I have taken and condensed as short as possible without losing important content. So 3 of the claims in this book have been fact-checked by various organizations. So in the interest of both time and fairness, I have edited out 2 out of those 3 disputed claims. But the most commonly fact-checked example in this is uranium-1, which we'll go over. And I did decide to leave that one in just because I want to respond to those fact checks when we're done watching this video. So this video is still about 20 minutes long, even condensed, but it's only a few minutes on each topic, so it does go pretty quickly. And I found it really interesting and hope you guys enjoy.
When we looked at Bill Clinton's pattern of giving speeches, we looked at who was paying him, when they were paying him, and if they have ever paid for a speech before. Well, Bill Clinton has been paid enormous sums of money over the years to give speeches. On average, he gets a little less than $200,000 per speech. But something happened in late 2008. His speaking fees skyrocketed after he'd been out of office for years. The reason was his wife had become Secretary of State. In fact, 11 of the 13 speeches for which Bill Clinton has been paid $500,000 or more occurred precisely when Hillary was the most powerful diplomat in the world. His single biggest speech payday came from the Swedish telecom company Ericsson, and it's a very, very unusual and troubling story. Now, Ericsson is a Swedish telecom company that in 2009 and 2010 was in trouble with Hillary Clinton's State Department because Ericsson was selling a lot of telecom equipment to Iran, to Belarus, and to other oppressive governments about which the State Department was concerned. Ericsson risked being put on a list by the federal government in the United States for trading with an enemy state. There was actually an effort being put forward in Washington to broaden Iranian sanctions to include the very technologies that Ericsson was selling to the Iranian government. So it's against this background that Ericsson decided now might be a good time to hire Bill Clinton to give a speech. They had never paid for a speech by him before, and they decided to go in big, $750,000 for a single speech. 7 days after he gave that speech, Hillary's State Department came out with a statement which said, we are not going to broaden sanctions on Iran to include technologies like telecom. We're going to rely and expect companies like Ericsson to police themselves. It was a massive win for Ericsson. Ericsson was able to avoid having to deal with a regulatory battle in Washington, giving up contracts that were highly lucrative in these countries, and being put on a list that would create an enormous diplomatic problem for them, all because essentially they paid Bill Clinton to give a speech for $750,000. So the question is, why do we see the Clintons reversing decades of policy positions that they've held so closely on issues like human rights and environment? And a big clue comes from the folks that are giving the Clinton Foundation literally tens of millions of dollars. And one, if not the biggest donor to the foundation, is a Canadian named Frank Giustra. Giustra is in the mining business, hardly something you'd call environmentally friendly. And he has interests all over the world. And he used his relationship with the Clintons to benefit those interests, regardless of the environmental concerns. A great example of this is what happened in Colombia. So in June of 2010, Bill Clinton and Frank Giustra fly to Bogota, Colombia. And who arrives there at roughly the same time? Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. The following morning, Bill Clinton has a breakfast meeting with the outgoing president of Colombia, President Uribe. Then, like a tag team, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has a noon lunch meeting with him, and she grants him several favors, including technical agreements that the Colombian government wants. In the days that follow, something dramatic happens. Frank Giustra has 3 companies that get major concessions from the Colombian government: Pacific Rubiales, Petroamerica, and Prima Colombia Properties. One of those, Prima Colombia Properties, gets a concession to cut timber in a rainforest in Colombia along the Pacific coast. And that timber is not intended to export to the United States, but is intended for export to China. There's an outrage and upset environmentalists who realize what's going on, and eventually that permit is yanked by a future president of Colombia, but not before Frank Giustra's company is able to profit from cutting down these rainforests, which again is a behavior that runs so contrary to what the Clintons profess to be in favor of. Paul Kagame has been praised by Bill Clinton and the Clinton Foundation. But the fact of the matter is Paul Kagame has a terrible human rights record. He's accused of aiding military operations in the neighboring Democratic Republic of Congo, and that actually forced the recruitment of child soldiers. The UN has identified him as being involved in activities that entailed massive human rights violations. Well, Paul Kagame is a friend of Bill Clinton's.
I want to say a special word of appreciation for the leadership of President Kagame.
I'm greatly humbled to receive this Clinton Global Citizen Award.
He's actually given awards by Bill Clinton for his conduct as the leader of that country, and they regale him as a great military leader. This is the sort of legitimization that we don't want of these kinds of dictators and leaders. That's the kind of legitimization that the Clintons have engaged in, and they've done it in a way that creates commercial opportunities for donors and friends and allies who want to do business in Africa. Business in Africa means you're dealing with dictators who are going to give you access to, say, mineral rights or oil drilling rights, but you're going to have to pay them off. The Clintons partner with foreign entities who want access to Africa, and specifically mining companies or energy companies who need to get concessions for access to oil or natural gas or the rights to mine for gold. Those two make a powerful alliance because these companies will give money to the Clintons, either in the form of speaking fees or in the form of donations to the Clinton Foundation. And the Clintons will then, in effect, do their bidding before the halls of power and corridors of power in Africa. And they will go to foreign governments and encourage them to do business with individuals who are putting money in their pocket. And this leads to some amazing fits of behavior that, in a way, are just reminiscent of 19th century colonialism. A perfect example of this is Ambassador Joe Wilson. Joe Wilson is a longtime friend of the Clintons. In fact, he endorsed Hillary Clinton in the 2008 presidential election, and it was also thought that he might become a senior official in Hillary Clinton's State Department. But the fact of the matter is Joe Wilson was up to something far more nefarious during Hillary Clinton's tenure as Secretary of State. In 2009, shortly after she became Secretary of State, when Wilson was the vice chairman of a company called Jarj Capital, they took out a 50-year lease on 400,000 hectares in South Sudan. South Sudan was in the middle of a civil war, and this lease was actually signed with warlords who were involved in the civil war. These individuals who were engaged in massive human rights violations, including the massacre of opponent tribes. And basically what Joe Wilson was engaged in was something called investing in sovereignty changes. They were basically cutting deals, lucrative deals, worth potentially hundreds of millions of dollars with these warlords. And the expectation was simple. These warlords would take power, then they would give them access to these lands where they could make huge amounts of money exploring for natural gas, exploring for oil, and for mineral rights. Swedish mining investor Lucas Lundin has pledged $100 million to the Clinton Foundation. He did that in 2007. And his most lucrative mining operations are in the war-torn country of the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is a country that perhaps has the most horrific human rights situation on the face of the earth. By the time Lucas Lundin made his $100 million pledge to the Clinton Foundation, his Congo operation was making, quote, staggering profits, end quote, according to his own financial statements. His overall capitalization was $20 billion. But for those profits to remain staggering, U.S. policy under Hillary Clinton had to remain unchanged. That's a problem. Hillary Clinton, as a senator back in 2006, supported something called the Congo Relief, Security, and Democracy Promotion Act. As the law's name implied, the goal was to bring reform to Congo. That's not something that Lucas Lundin would want. So in 2009, when Hillary became Secretary of State, she reversed course 180 degrees and went from supporting reform in Congo to supporting the status quo, which is exactly what Lucas Lundin would want, who of course had committed $100 million to the Clinton Foundation. Look at a country like Nigeria, which is really a cesspool of corruption. In fact, people will say it is perhaps the most corrupt country in the world. It's rich in natural resources, it produces a lot of oil, but that money never trickles down to the people. It goes to the oligarchs who run the country, who oftentimes take that money and put it in Swiss bank accounts in a way that, of course, the people of Nigeria can never benefit from. And you see, there's a federal law in the United States which says if foreign governments that receive U.S. assistance aren't transparent in how they spend that money, that they will not be able to get U.S. foreign assistance anymore. It's about transparency. But there's a way around that law. You can get a waiver from that law. How? By getting the U.S. Secretary of State to grant you a waiver. So in the case of Nigeria, they receive hundreds of millions of dollars in U.S. foreign assistance. They've not made progress in being more transparent. And of course, they've gotten exemptions from Hillary Clinton while she was Secretary of State. What's so curious about this is what was happening commercially to the Clintons while this was going on. Bill Clinton, for the first time ever, gets paid highly lucrative speeches in Nigeria, which had never happened before. In fact, he gets paid to do 2 speeches for $700,000 apiece by a businessman in Nigeria who just happens to be close with the president of that country. Keep in mind, by the way, that his normal speaking fee is less than $200,000 a speech. So it's a classic example of what some people call disaster capitalism. Disaster capitalism in that a natural disaster creates opportunities for rebuilding to take place, but also for self-enrichment to take place. And if you look at the Clintons and the promises that were made and the results that actually followed, it is a tragic story of crony capitalism gone awry. The single largest relief project that the United States committed taxpayer dollars to, $124 million to be exact, was a project called Caricom, a textile factory that was built in the northern part of the country that was supposed to create some 60,000 jobs and was supposed to create tremendous economic growth. There's a problem here already. You see, the earthquake affected the southern part of Haiti. The northern part of the country was entirely unaffected. But who were the beneficiaries of this? Companies like Gap, Target, and Walmart, to name a few. The Caricom factory was built, which didn't create 60,000 jobs. It created barely 5,000 jobs. But the major American companies who got textiles tariff-free, made at low wages, benefited enormously. And the end effect on the Haitians was very, very minimal. So you had contracts going to these relief organizations that were also involved with the Clinton Global Initiative. And you had this one organization, Dahlberg, that was supposed to do an assessment for relocating people that suffered from the earthquake. They determined that people should be moved to a site that happened to be on a cliff that was highly unstable. USAID's Inspector General reviewed Dahlberg's recommendations and found them basically unusable. One member of the USAID shelter team was quoted by Rolling Stone magazine as saying that the recommendations were so bad, it looked like the team never even got out of their SUVs. Another person said that only one of the people that was sent to Haiti by Dahlberg actually spoke French. For all of Bill Clinton's talk about building Haiti back better, the fact remains that the most visible evidence of Clinton's role in the recovery isn't the improvement of daily life for everyday Haitians, but the construction of new luxury hotels just miles from the folks who have been living in tarps USAID handed out immediately after the earthquake.
We are telling the world of the crimes that Bill and Hillary Clinton are responsible for in Haiti.
So how much do connections to the Clintons matter when you're talking about Haiti? Consider the case of gold mining. The government of Haiti had not granted a gold mining concession in 50 years. They decided to do so during the reconstruction of their country, which was being overseen by Bill and Hillary Clinton. What company did they select to get this gold mining permit? A company called VCS Mining. VCS Mining had very little experience in gold mining, but what did they have? They had connections. Shortly after they got that concession, someone joined their board of directors. It just happened to be Tony Rodham, brother of Hillary Rodham Clinton. It was a true disaster that followed the earthquake, which was the natural disaster. This was the man-made Clinton-caused disaster in relief that led to the wasting of enormous sums of money, the enrichment of elites that were friends with the Clintons, and the Haitians were left in a situation where their life was really not much better than it was the day after the earthquake happened. One of the signature achievements in foreign policy for Bill Clinton was pushing the Test Ban Treaty and the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Today in New York, the United Nations General Assembly voted overwhelmingly to adopt the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and open it for signature later this month.
The NPT has been sort of the holy grail when it comes to nuclear disarmament, something that the Clintons have been supportive of, not just for years, but for decades. That was all thrown asunder in 1998 when the Indian government tested nuclear weapons underground.
India's action threatens the stability of Asia and challenges the firm international consensus to stop all nuclear testing.
These were tests that truly shocked the world. Even the CIA was not aware that these tests were about to take place. Clinton's reaction was volcanic. He felt betrayed by the Indian government, and as a result, he imposed sanctions on India, essentially saying, you're not going to get access to U.S. nuclear technology until you sign the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. In 2005, the Indian government wanted to get these sanctions lifted. Not only do they have an interest in expanding their civilian nuclear base, they live in a neighborhood where some pretty tough customers and rivals have nuclear weapons themselves. First of all, you've got Pakistan, which is right next door, which is widely believed to have nuclear weapons. And then you have China, a longtime rival of India, which has a nuclear arsenal. The Clintons said that they were in favor of giving the Indian government some access, but the problem is it didn't go nearly as far as the Indian government wanted. So in 2005, they started making donations to the Clinton Foundation. We're talking about tens of millions of dollars from Indian interests flowing into the Clinton Foundation. And we're talking about at least hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in speeches that Bill Clinton was paid by interested parties in the Indian nuclear deal. Amar Singh, according to Clinton disclosures, has given between $1 and $5 million to the Clinton Foundation in the push to get them to support Indian access to nuclear technology. He's a member of parliament who has gotten in fistfights on the floor of the parliament, who's been charged with bribing members of parliament to get certain pieces of legislation passed. You see, the problem is when you ask Amar Singh, he says it wasn't my money. I don't have that kind of money. I couldn't have given him that amount of money. And in fact, when you look at Indian public records, you see that Amar Singh doesn't have a net worth anything close to being able to give that amount of money. So where did the money come from? Well, sometimes the most obvious answer is the correct one. Sant Chantwal is an Indian businessman who has been close to the Clintons for years. He pledged to raise $5 million for her 2008 presidential campaign. And Bill Clinton was at his son's wedding. They actually named him as a trustee of the Clinton Foundation. When Hillary Clinton was first running for the Senate in 2000, Sant Chantwal was in trouble with a federal agency called the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. He basically owed them millions of dollars from unpaid loans. Well, in 2000, Chantwal throws a fundraiser for Hillary Clinton, and he brings in $500,000. A few months later, with Bill Clinton still president of the United States, Sant Chantwal's case with the FDIC was abruptly settled for a mere $125,000. So basically, the federal government got pennies on the dollar. He would actually go on to plead guilty for funneling $180,000 in illegal campaign contributions to Hillary Clinton, among others. Well, maybe one reason no one made the connection is because the Clinton Foundation mysteriously erased any mention of Sant Chantwal from the website once he had admitted to his illegal activity. So here we are years later, and we've got this donation in a guy's name who swears he didn't actually make the donation. And you've got this longtime Clinton benefactor who actually gets the highest civilian award in India because of his role in changing Hillary Clinton's mind on this nuke deal. And lo and behold, by 2008, Hillary Clinton was fully in support and in favor of this policy in a way that was a complete reversal of the position that she had taken before. In other words, the flow of money had led the Clintons to change their positions on the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and specifically, India getting access to U.S. nuclear technology. This was a decision that was wholly out of step, wholly inconsistent with a progressive liberal agenda. Hillary Clinton made a decision of reversing her previous position after the flow of funds to the Clinton Foundation, and her husband gave some speeches in India. At the end of the day, this is a story about buying influence and selling influence. The Clintons are the sellers of influence. The Canadian investors and the Russians are the buyers. Bill Clinton had gone to the Central Asian country of Kazakhstan in 2005 with Frank Justra. Kazakhstan is a country that's been run since the collapse of the Soviet Union by a dictator named Nazarbayev, who shuts down political opposition and tortures political opponents. The ostensible purpose of the visit to Kazakhstan by Bill Clinton was to talk with Nazarbayev about AIDS HIV. The problem is Kazakhstan really does not have an AIDS HIV problem. So that explanation really doesn't make sense. What makes far more sense is that Frank Justra wanted access to very lucrative Kazakh uranium mines. Kazakhstan is one of the largest producers of uranium in the world. Bill Clinton arrives there with Frank Justra, and they have a series of meetings with Kazakh officials. There's a press conference where Bill Clinton stands with the dictator of Kazakhstan, and he praises the human rights record. He praises that elections are being held in the country, and he even says that Kazakhstan should head up something called the OSCE, which is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Think about that for a second. Bill Clinton is saying that a known human rights violator who's been condemned by human rights organizations around the world should head up a human rights organization. They go from a press conference to a dinner where Frank Justra, Nazarbayev, the dictator of Kazakhstan, and Bill Clinton meet and talk. Well, 2 days after that meeting, Frank Justra finally gets his uranium concessions with hundreds of millions of dollars. A couple of weeks after that, Bill Clinton gets his $30 million from Frank Justra, the first payment in what will become more than $100 million in pledges and commitments and donations made by Frank Justra. So it's really, in a way, a simple story in that they all are walking away from the table with something that they want. Nazarbayev is getting the legitimacy of an ex-president, saying what a nice and kind leader he is. Frank Justra gets his uranium concession, and Bill Clinton and his foundation get cold, hard cash. Frank Justra takes that uranium concession he got in Kazakhstan and puts it into a company in a so-called reverse merger, which was one way for a private company to go public to form something called Uranium One. It's a company traded on the stock market in Canada, and they start acquiring uranium concessions in places like Wyoming, Texas, New Mexico, and Utah. And by 2009, they have what is expected to be 50% of future uranium production in the United States. This gets the interest of Vladimir Putin and the Russian government. And in fact, there are State Department cables that were leaked through WikiLeaks, which show that Hillary was aware of the fact that the Russians took great care to try to dominate the international uranium market. Well, the Russians want to buy this asset, and they offer a 40% silver price on the share of the stock. And for this transaction to go through, it has to be approved by the U.S. federal government. Why? Because uranium is regarded as a critical industry in the United States. After all, this is used for our civilian nuclear reactors and goes into nuclear weapons. So it goes before the federal government, where it needs to be signed off by a series of federal agencies, including the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. As Hillary Clinton is contemplating this, shareholders in Uranium One, including Frank Justra, have sent more than $145 million to the Clinton Foundation. The chairman of that company at the precise time is a guy named Ian Telfer, who is also making donations to the Clinton Foundation, as is Frank Holmes, who is another major Uranium One shareholder. And Hillary Clinton, who has a record of opposing precisely these kinds of deals, comes out and says, you know what, I think this is a good deal. Let's let Vladimir Putin take control of what is now 20% of U.S. uranium production. What's so interesting when you consider this uranium deal are the actions of a small Canadian investment firm called Salida Capital. Salida Capital, in 2010, as this deal was going down, committed to give millions of dollars to the Clinton Foundation, and they also sponsored a speech by Bill Clinton in Canada. Salida Capital is also the name of a wholly owned subsidiary of Rosatom. Who is Rosatom? Well, this is the government agency in Russia that controls their nuclear arsenal, that built nuclear reactors in Iran, and engages in nuclear technology exchanges with rogue countries like North Korea. What this means, in essence, is that the Russian government, specifically Rosatom, was funneling money through a subsidiary directly to the Clinton Foundation. But the payday didn't end there. 4 months before Hillary Clinton's State Department would sign off on the Russian purchase of Uranium One, Bill Clinton got paid $500,000 to give a single speech in Moscow. He was being paid by a firm called Renaissance Capital, which has a long history of association with Russian intelligence services. What makes this speech stand out is not only the timing of when he's being paid, but the amount that he's being paid. You see, the last time Bill Clinton gave a speech in Russia was 5 years earlier. At that time, he was paid about 1/3 of what he was being paid this time. What we've essentially done is handed this precious resource to Vladimir Putin and the Russian government. They're not only engaged in aggression in places like Ukraine, but they've been very aggressive in fighting American interests around the globe. Russia's not an ally. Russia's not a friend. Vladimir Putin's Russia is a rival of the United States, and yet we've given them control over this precious resource.
Uranium-1 is the example most commonly known, and I have read many fact checks that dismiss this as a nothing burger. Similar to what we saw regarding the Seth Rich botched robbery, they will dismiss all evidence shown in that documentary as conspiracy theory nonsense, when in actuality, they don't come close to debunking anything at all. If you read these fact checks, you will see that there are 3 common ways in which the media debunks these allegations. The first is the one you see right here by NPR. They debunk this by saying, well, it was 20% of U.S. uranium when the deal was made, but now it's not 20% anymore. And then they irrelevantly state what the global percentage would be, even though that has absolutely nothing to do with the fact that they are supposed to be analyzing. So for the purposes of the claim relevant to when this deal was made, this claim is true.
So number 2, these fact checkers say that Hillary was not involved in this Uranium-1 decision at the State Department, which is interesting because it's so important that it required approval from, I believe, 9 different government agencies, but she handed that one off to her deputy to sign off on. And I love how Hillary always has a scapegoat. She thinks she's entitled to be the leader of the free world, yet she's never been accountable for any decision in her entire life. Just like how her best friend Uma signed off on State Department decisions regarding the foundation, or how it was one of her aides who smashed her phones with a hammer, Hillary is always able to skate by on this technicality that she never personally is involved in any of these decisions. And lastly, the fact checkers will take Hillary's word for it that this pattern of pay to play is nothing more than a coincidence. Yes, the donations occurred. Yes, the favors came from Hillary's State Department, but there's no smoking gun that proves those 2 actions are connected. So I take issue with this for 3 reasons. 1, it doesn't take a very stable genius to see the strong likelihood that the missing evidence of intent here is what she deleted in those 30,000 emails, not yoga and Chelsea's wedding. Number 2, how on earth can you call yourself an independent fact checker when all you've done is called up the accused and asked them if they've committed a crime and then took their word for it when they said no? It's like believing Casey Anthony when she said that her daughter had been gone for a month with a nanny named Zanny. Case closed, no further questions asked. The story's been officially debunked. Hillary's story is no less ridiculous than that just because she happens to be a politician. And for the life of me, I can't understand why people accept that BS when it does come from a politician, because they would never accept it if it came from anyone else. Which brings me to my final issue with these fact checks. If the $145 million donation was simply a coincidence, why did she recuse herself from that decision in the first place? These 2 points that are made by Hillary and the fact checkers directly contradict each other. She can't have it both ways. Either the donations were a coincidence, or she was fulfilling her agreements to not personally be involved in interests that might concern Bill Clinton and the foundation. And if it was a coincidence, how come no one has asked her, why did you recuse yourself from that decision? If you didn't know the money was coming, there was no reason for you to not be involved. So I don't know what the facts are regarding Hillary Clinton, the Clinton Foundation, Uranium-1, but I do know that Hillary's 2 defenses here are mutually exclusive. And a fact checker should have caught that. So whatever the truth is, Hillary isn't telling it. So that's all I have for part 2. Thanks for watching the Genuine Questions mini-series on Hillary's email scandal. Tune in to part 3, where we will discuss golf, grandkids, and James Comey.